Hey guys! So it's been a long time since my Silver Eyes video, but today is going to be your happiest day because I finally got the Twisted One summary done. So, on with the story. We start off in what's becoming a pretty typical fashion for these books by describing the past to explain how we got to the present. After the events of the last novel, Charlie went back to live with her Aunt Jen. As soon as Charlie hits her 18th birthday, though, she starts having these dreams about her brother Sammy. In them, she's crawling around in the dark looking for Sammy until she'd eventually hit a wall made of cold metal. She later describes it to John. It's like he's trapped somewhere, like he's in a box or I'm in a box, I can't tell. Because of this pull to her brother Sammy, she has a longing to be closer to where he was and decides that she wants to go back to Hurricane. She approaches Aunt Jen about going to St. George College in Hurricane, and Aunt Jen is understandably upset about this development. They get into their first ever fight, which ultimately leads to Charlie walking out the door and not returning. She shows up at St. George and knocks on her friend Jessica's door, the same one from Silver Eyes, who is going to the same college. She talks the admission staff into letting her go there even though it's incredibly last minute, and now she's staying with Jessica and going to college for robotics. Imagine that. In fact, the book starts out with her sitting in a robotics class. They explain a concept that is basically the foreshadowing for the whole book about how your brain can't process everything it sees, and so it has a built-in mechanism to sort of fill in the blanks. We'll see more of that later. So, there's an annoying guy in Charlie's class who quite obviously has been friend-zoned. His name is Artie, but I really can't say he has a real necessity to be in this book. He serves merely as a catalyst to explain things to someone else instead of internally, so we'll forget about him and move on. Before heading out to meet John for the first time in a while, she goes to her dorm room to introduce us to her project. It's basically two faces that she is trying to teach to talk to each other. They don't really make much sense though, as all they say are things like, "You are? Am I?" I'm guessing this project is some sort of euphemism for Charlie and Sammy, or perhaps for the things she doesn't know about herself. Moving along, she meets up with John, who's also moved to town for a construction job. Apparently, there was a pretty nasty hurricane in Hurricane, and there was a pretty strong need for help in cleaning up and rebuilding. John informs her that her dad's house was one of the homes hit by the storm, and Charlie also opens up and tells him about her weird dreams. Before he can say anything, she clams up and wants to take off. Before she can leave, John asks her on a date, to which she agrees. The whole thing is very awkward, but yay, young love. As she's headed to her next class, she runs into no other than Clay Burke. You remember the weird sheriff from the first book who was also Cartland's father. Yep, that guy. He wants her to take a look at a body, which has got to be the most unorthodox thing I've ever heard of, but okay, let's go with it. They arrive to the scene, which is in a big pasture, cows and all. Clay shows her the body of a man, as it is described in the book. His whole body was drenched red with blood. His clothes were torn, almost shredded, and through the holes, Charlie thought she could see ripped up skin, some bone, and other things she couldn't identify. Upon looking closer, she sees that on each side of the man's neck are the telltale wounds of spring locks. After making Clay take the corpse's shirt off so she can make sure the scars are the same as she saw on Dave, the security guard's chest, she confirms that this man must have died from wearing one of those springlock suits. Being concerned about good old Dave, Charlie asks about what happened to Freddy's. He informs her that they never found Dave's body and that the whole place had been ordered to be demolished. The animatronics were treated as trash and removed. Clay insists that they were lifeless and that that's just how these things go. The storm apparently interrupted the demolition though, and so some of the restaurant was still left intact, but nothing that mattered. He adds in one more crucial detail about the scene, that the blood they found where Dave had died wasn't real blood. He says it's some kind of costume blood that they didn't realize was fake until looking under a microscope. What could this mean? Could Dave be some kind of advanced animatronic? Even more so, the thought that Dave might still be alive, considering he already survived the suit once, and they couldn't find his body. She next heads out to meet John for their awkward date, where they eat dinner and watch a zombie movie. After the movie, Charlie breaks the ice and tells John about Clay and the body he showed her. She also tells him about the fake blood, and they discuss the possibility of Dave still being alive. At this point, Charlie gets it in her head that she's going to go back to Freddy's and try to find Dave's body. She lies to John and tells him she thinks Clay has it under control, and heads back to her dorm to ask Jessica to go with her to Freddy's. Things get delayed until the next day because Jessica is far more interested in how the date went. Charlie has a bad dream, and when she wakes up, John is at her door for some reason, and she blows him off so that she can drag Jessica out to do girl stuff, which really means going to Freddy's. They make their way through the abandoned mall to where the old restaurant was. When they get there, the place is completely shot. Sunlight is coming through, and while some walls stood, the whole place was a wreck with bricks and other debris everywhere. After hunting through the remnants, they eventually find claw marks on the floor headed towards the stage, which was still mostly intact. They find a small hatch in the back labeled storage, and upon opening it, find an entire mascot suit stuffed inside the tiny space. It's the yellow rabbit. It's Dave. They managed to pull him out, as he was stuck in there pretty good, and the thing is just nasty. It's Dave alright, and he's inside the rabbit suit, but things don't look quite right. The suit's fabric was stiff with blood too, yet the man didn't seem to have rotted, despite the year that had passed. It's kind of weird, especially considering the whole fake blood thing. The next day in class, after staring at these weird rectangles she drew all over her notebook, Charlie gets it in her head to go back to her father's house. On the way there, she notices turkey vultures flying around a field and decides to pull over to see what they're after. She finds another Springlock suit victim, but this time it's a woman and it looks eerily like Charlie. Realizing she needs to get help, she runs off to find a payphone to call Clay. The days before cell phones. After calling from a gas station, she waits with the body for Clay to get there. He agrees that the girl looks just like her, going as far as to say she could be her twin. He also tells her that another body was found that morning, another woman. Charlie wants to help stop these murders and asks Clay for information about where the woman lying at their feet lived. They check her pockets for an ID to get an address, and Clay promises her 20 minutes before he calls it in. The woman's name was Tracy Horton, and she lived in a small house off a back road. After knocking with no answer, Charlie tried the door and it was unlocked. She looked through the whole house, but there was nothing of note. She checked the car, still in the driveway, and nothing. She finally found something in the backyard, 3 huge holes in the ground. They were lined up next to one another, and they were shallow, but the dirt at the bottom was loose. Charlie grabbed a stick off the ground and poked it into the middle hole. It went in almost a foot before it was stopped by denser soil. The dirt dug out of them was strewn messily around. Whoever dug the holes had carelessly tossed it everywhere, not bothering to pile it up. She lowered herself into one of the holes, and it came up to her waist. All of the dirt inside was loose, and she thought that something climbed out of the holes, but what? She got out of the hole and back to her car before the cops arrived, and then realized that she was about 2 hours late for another date with John. She rushes to the restaurant and finds him still there waiting. She looks a mess, and he's kind of confused about what's going on. Charlie heads to the bathroom to clean up, but instead uses the payphone to call Clay. They had both seen the holes in the backyard, and Charlie wanted to know if the other victims' backyards had the same holes. Clay gave her the names and addresses of the others, which she wrote down on takeout menu. Afterwards, she actually goes to the bathroom to clean up, but has another episode where she's thinking about Sammy's kidnapping and being trapped in some room. She yells out when John comes to the door and makes a scene. She then insists that she wants to go to her dad's house, as she's convinced her father must have had something to do with making the things that were now killing people. When they get to her old house, she sees that it's in pretty rough shape, as several trees have fallen on it, and you can see straight to the beams in some spots. The door is intact, though, so she decides against good judgment and heads inside. In visiting her room and looking upon the 3 closets, she realized that the scribbles she's been drawing in her notes were doors, but not these doors, she seems to intuit. They explore her father's workshop, which has been severely damaged, but find nothing. Just as Charlie succumbs to despair, John notices a hole in the bottom level of the house under her room. Charlie notes that the living room should be under her room, and that this hole is going to a room that isn't a part of the house. "I've never seen this room before," Charlie whispered. It was a small room with no windows and a dirt floor. In the dirt floor were 3 holes, and I'm guessing you can connect them to the holes from the dead lady's yard. Her attention is drawn to a concrete wall that seems strangely familiar. She places her palms and her ear to the door and can swear she hears movement. At that point, John discovers something and calls for Charlie's attention. Something metal with a plastic eye was sticking out of the ground near John. She dug the thing out by sweeping the dirt to the side. The creature she uncovered was very generic and vague. It resembled an animal, but only slightly. It had no fur, and its face was smooth. It was like the animatronics she had seen, but was far too large for anyone to wear. The thing was 8 feet tall. Charlie poked around the inner workings of the animatronic and notes that the hardware and joints are much older, like maybe it was made before the ones they know from the pizzeria. She recognized some of it as her dad's work, but the rest wasn't familiar at all. As she tries to dig the thing out more, its arms reach up and its center cavity opens. Suddenly it changes, and now it appears to have skin and fur, although blurry and flickering on and off. The thing grabs Charlie and tries to pull her inside. John ends up yanking its head off to save her. Afterwards, John feels sick, like something is making him nauseous, but he can't figure out what. Charlie notices a very slight sound coming from the animatronic, and she pries a small disc from out of the chest cavity. The disc was emitting a high-pitched sound that somehow was making an illusion of life on the animatronic. When it was removed, the animatronic looked like a lump of raw metal again. Charlie remarks how she has seen a disc like this before amongst her father's things and wants to find out more. Back at the dorm, Charlie pulls a box out from under her bed that had a bunch of her dad's things in it. While Charlie hunts through the box of parts, John remarks on the state of her living quarters and makes inappropriately timed comments about how there won't be room on her bed for when she gets married. Okay, John, yeah, sure. Now's the perfect time for that sort of thing. She finally finds what she had been looking for. It was an exact replica of the disc, except one side had been damaged and had wires connecting it to a keypad. The two consider that her father may have been running diagnostics on the disc to figure out what it was, as none of his other electronics used this specific type of disc. They find the words Afton Robotics, LLC, imprinted on the old disc. Afton, her dad's old partner, aka Dave the Guard, aka Crazy Nutjob from the first book. The two of them discuss the locations of the murders and try to figure out which way these animatronics are going. Charlie gets a map out from her car and circles the spots on the map where people have been killed and notices a direct line headed towards her college. They figure they're walking at night and burying themselves come daybreak to hide, and when the sun goes down, they kill and continue traveling. So with some idea of where the animatrons are going, Jessica, John, and Charlie all pile in the car, and they went to a nearly abandoned, run-down apartment complex where it seemed nobody could possibly live, but some did as there were parked cars in the lot. Charlie notices an open area that had been used as a dumping ground and finds a trail the animatrons made from the forest. She grabs a shovel from her car and begins digging up the mound the tracks had led to. Not far under the gravel, they find Freddy. Proving that they didn't really have a solid plan to begin with, Charlie sends Jessica and John out with the car to find a payphone and call Burke, because her staying alone with a homicidal animatronic can only be a good idea. Eventually, Clay, John, and Jessica return to the lot. Charlie shows Clay the strange Freddy, and he's concerned with how large they are. They decide that it would be a good idea to evacuate the people living nearby as dusk approaches. After Clay sets off towards the apartments, Jessica notices a strange sound. Charlie looks down at the Freddy lying in the ground and sees that he is changing, his features becoming smoother and less crude. Clay returns before Freddy can further resurrect, and he orders them to pile into his police cruiser so he can lead the nearby tenants away. After the tenants are escorted out, they park nearby to the lot and wait for the animatrons to wake up fully. In the car, Charlie tries to run diagnostics on the small disc again. She explains that the disc changes their perception of what the animatronics look like. It runs a sound in a pattern almost that sort of makes sense, but not entirely. And so since the brain is overwhelmed and distracted, it automatically fills in the blanks of how the animatrons should look. Instead of a crudely made face, made of bumps, suddenly you see a friendly face. Well, I'm not so sure that would work for me, but it would probably work on kids. Eventually, everyone falls asleep in the car except for Clay, who vigilantly stands watch. The lone light post that he had been using to keep guard on the mounds went dark, and with this he decided to get out of the car and go investigate in person. Charlie wakes up and notices Clay's absence. She runs out of the car, and as she reaches the empty graves, she sees that they're gone. Clay is there by the graves and tells her to go back to the car, but of course she doesn't listen. They hear a scream in the night and realize they haven't been successful in evacuating everyone. Charlie notices movement in the dark and follows it after yelling for her friends to follow her. She expects they're right on her tail, but when she stops, she realizes she is alone, and then she sees it. A figure hunched in the woods with a thin snout and a wolf's mane. It was staring right at her, and as it stood there, she could see the creature shifting, constantly changing from what looked like an organic, real creature to a tattered mess of metal. As she watched, The creature shuddered and lurched over as something fell out of its center. Clay arrived to Charlie's location just in time to see the body that lay in the grass. The woman was still alive and shaking horribly. While Clay stays with the woman, the others run to get help. Back at school the next day, Charlie can't stop thinking about the strange wolf creature she had seen. She thinks back on old memories with her father and recalls the time when her father tried to give her a robotic frog toy that she rejected because she didn't like the eyes. Her father had brought the frog back to his workbench and started dismantling it, which made her feel guilt over its death, as seen by a child, of course. She recalls how he never wasted any spare parts, and for him to bury those 4 animatronics under the house like he did made no sense to her. He wouldn't waste the parts because they were too expensive. So why would he have buried them alive? After class, John finds her in the halls and lets her know that Clay was trying to contact her, but couldn't obviously because she wasn't in her room. He says that the woman they found survived, and also that they found where the animatrons will go next. That it's an area mostly with fields and one house that is vacant, and Clay has a plan for the next night. Charlie goes back to her dorm alone and has a dialogue with her dismembered toy rabbit, Theodore. She basically says that she's concerned that the disc makes John sick, but sings a song to her. She says that she feels certain that she has to be the one to deal with these animatronics, that Afton is the one who made them and Afton was the one who took Sammy. She recalls that when she was in her house with John, when they found the crude animatrons, that she felt something that was like a lost part of herself, that she couldn't reach. She knew doing this was the only way she felt she could get answers. She drove to the vacant house all alone. This place was completely isolated and was most certainly the next destination that the creatures would head to. She attempts to enter the home, and fortunately it's unlocked. She realizes that everything in the house is fake for the most part, and that it must be a show home. She goes into the bedroom and lays on the bed and waits for the animatrons to come for her. In the meantime, John is being blown off for yet another date with Charlie, and as he waits he realizes there may be a problem. He calls Clay and asks him if he's heard from Charlie, letting him know that she's 24 minutes late. Clay says he'll be there soon. Back at the vacant house with Charlie, she is still waiting for the creatures to show. Finally they do, and she hears their footsteps all over the house while she sits in the dark. It is Freddy who emerges first from the darkness. As he yanks the blanket from the bed, he doesn't look crudely shapen anymore, but has bouncy cheeks and fur all over his face. Freddy's face slid across the bed like a python. His head lost its shape as it folded outward, taking hold of her feet and beginning to swallow, moving slowly upward as she fought not to scream or fight. A giant arm reached up and clapped the side of the bed, shaking the room as it anchored itself and pulled the giant torso higher. The thing swallows her up, and she is pinned tightly inside of it. Clay and John make it to the place far too late, and they find that Charlie is already gone. They get back in the car and try to follow the route the animatrons should be going if they're headed in the same direction that they've been going. They meet up with Jessica, who John had called earlier to meet them. Jessica jokes about how it's too bad they can't ask the old mascots from Freddy's where the creatures were taking Charlie, as they were having no luck finding any traces of them. Thinking it's a good idea, John presses Clay for more information about what happened to the mascots when Freddy's was gutted. In a strange twist, Clay confesses that he actually kept the mascots and that they are currently in his basement. He says that he couldn't just dismantle them, especially knowing that they had been children he knew. He had let them stay undisturbed in his basement without any problems from them for some time now. So they all go to Clay's house, deciding it's a good idea to try and get some help from the old mascots. John tries to awaken the mascots, but they all stay motionless and still. After quite some time, Jessica suggests that maybe they should just leave, but John disagrees. "I think there's still someone in there," he said softly. As he says this, Jessica screams as the mascots move and their heads all turn to look at John and Jessica. John turns to the animatronics and tells them what has happened, that there is another set of animatronics that are like them but not like them, and that they have taken Charlie, that they were made by William Afton. At the sound of Afton's name, the mascots all start to convulse and freak out. They all run out of the basement to take shelter as they are still understandably worried that they might get hurt by the mascots. In a cacophony of twisting metal and heavy footsteps, all of the mascots left the basement. They heard a thud and then cracking wood as the mascots created a wider door for them to fit through. When the noise had subsided, the trio left their hiding spot and followed the path of destruction the mascots had made. Outside, the grass was torn up where the mascots had been, and so it was easy to follow them. When we go back to Charlie, she's just waking up inside the animatronic. She was in immense pain as each footfall of the suit she was in sent pieces digging into her. A stray piece of metal stabs her, and she thinks that the suit will all come undone and kill her. But thankfully, it's just one piece. The animatron falls to its side, and Charlie falls along with it, hitting her head and being knocked unconscious. Back with the gang, they're busy trailing the mascots, who are completely hauling ass to some unknown destination. They are moving almost too fast, and the group is having trouble keeping up. Eventually, they do lose them completely, and just then, when they're not sure what to do next, they hear the sound of something rustling in the trees. Not far in, the trees break into a clearing, and there's a field. In the field, they saw a shadowy figure that looked a lot like Freddy. It wasn't moving. "I don't know what it is," John answered cautiously, "but I think it wants us to follow." Charlie awakes again to find herself being buried alive as dirt is pouring through the holes in the animatronic and slowly filling the empty space. She works to get her arms free so that she might escape, but they're currently pinned to her sides. Once she does get them free, she pushes her way out through the chest plate, and as she does, more dirt rushes in. She digs and wriggles her way out of the hole and finally makes it out. Stunned, she sits for a while before she became aware of her surroundings. She was indoors somewhere and could hear rushing water in the distance. She was covered in blood and bruises, but there were no major injuries, and nothing was broken. As she looked around, she stopped in horror as she realized she was at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The tables, the carousel in the corner, the stage, the tablecloths are blue. The tablecloths at Freddy's weren't blue. She said, but her relief was quickly washed away by confusion. Then what is this place? Before I continue, I'm going to make a sort of disclaimer here about the layout of this place. I consider myself pretty good at being able to imagine a room or an environment based on text. I've even created some pretty awesome memories just based on stuff I've read because I can imagine them so well. I had a lot of trouble figuring out how this place was supposed to look, and that may be just because this place was chaotic. I think it was supposed to be some kind of crazy place that kids would like and was designed in a way to be sort of whimsical and magical. It's not clear to me why there was actual dirt inside the place where the animatronics could bury themselves, and I wish it would have been clarified why it was there. Maybe he actually had an outdoorsy sort of area where there was dirt and grass. Who knows? So I apologize if this part is confusing. Just know that it is confusing to read even when you have the book in your hands. So it's likely going to be confusing to hear as well. I tried to leave out a lot of the unnecessary elements of the design that didn't feel pertinent, so just try not to focus on it anyway. Let's go. Charlie noticed that the floor in the dining room had black and white tile as she walked through. She also noticed several animatronic birds on the wall, but they didn't move. They were perched above arcade games all along the wall. Charlie hears music playing through the speaker system and notes that it's familiar, but she can't place it. Further down, she sees 3 chimpanzee animatronics up on the wall over some more arcade games. She notices that all of the arcade screens are shiny and new, that none of them have the typical burnt-in images that showed up even when the machine was off, and that these had never been used or not used much. Charlie notices the purple sheen of a black light in the distance and heads towards it. She finds more games guarded by all different types of animatronic animals. Suddenly, she hears someone call, "Hello," in the distance. She answers back to it with her own hello, but nobody answers. She searches for what she perceives to be a lost child or someone that's hurt and focuses in on a tablecloth. After looking under it, she sees eyes for a second that quickly vanish and nobody is there. She notices a growing pain in her temples. I thought this might be the discs at first, but it doesn't make sense considering the other disc never gave her a headache. She finds the source of the water she heard through another door as she finds a waterfall coming out of a pipe in the wall. The waterfall turned into a stream that separated the room, and beyond it was a large cave. She sees a small cobblestone path that ran through a narrow passage under the waterfall. She follows the path and finds an area with machinery to run the waterfall, as well as several gas cans to run the machinery. "Hello," the voice calls out again, a little louder. She merged into another room, and she saw a figure in the center of it. Another animatronic made to look like a boy selling balloons. And Balloon Boy makes his cameo. He is described as looking exactly the same as the animatronic from the game. He was perhaps 4 feet tall with a round head and a round body, his arms almost as long as his stout legs. He wore a red and blue striped shirt and a matching propeller hat on his head. His nose was a triangle and his cheeks were made rosy with 2 raised circles of dusky pink. In one hand he held a red and yellow balloon, and in the other he raised a wooden sign reading "Balloons." As she was looking around, she heard the voice say, "Hello," again, and as she turned around, she saw him move his body to look at her. She screams and runs back the way she had come. Beneath her feet, the dirt began to stir, and something breaks free to the surface. I'm not even sure what is going on at this point, and I'm pretty sure that was the point, because whatever device is messing with Charlie's head is making it incredibly difficult to discern reality from fantasy. All of the animatronics on the wall come to life and start making tons of noise. The room becomes incredibly dizzying to Charlie as her mind starts to go numb. She falls to the ground as another mound of dirt erupts and something shiny comes out of it. She tries to make it to the arcade machines. She staggered toward them, her head swaying so heavy she could hardly stay upright. The walls were crawling with activity. Small things skittered disjointedly all over the ceiling, but she couldn't see what they were. They were wriggling under the paint. The surface undulated chaotically. There was a strange ringing in the air, and though she only now registered it, she realized it had been sounding all along. Sitting on the ground now, she hears the "hello" again and looks up to see several children standing around her. Feeling like her eyes are playing tricks on her, not knowing if this is real or imagined, she yells at them to stay back as she tries to take shelter and hide. The children follow her around, constantly harassing her. She can hear the grind of metal nearby and knows something else much worse is stalking her. Charlie ends up hiding underneath a dining room table, beneath the tablecloth. Not long after she hid, something was moving the tablecloth, patting the outside of it. On all sides of the tablecloth, the children were jumping up and down, brushing against it. Before she knew it, the blurry faces of 4 children were facing her from every side of the tablecloth. She ran out from under the table and noticed a door besides the stage that she had made a dash for. The door opened, and inside she was safe from the harassing children, for the moment at least. As her eyes adjust to the darkness, she can see that the room is for the storage of different animatronics and their parts. Fur, torsos, and different arms, all unfinished mascots. In the corner she finds the Freddy from earlier, the same one she dug up in the lot, the one that had taken her, but he's not moving. She can't make sense of it being the same one. How would it get in here? Before she can think much about what to do next, Freddy comes back to life right in front of her. She ducks down to the ground and attempts to crawl under the animatronics in the room to the door, but Freddy grabs her leg as she passes. She tries to grab the leg of a pinball machine to wrench herself free from his grip as Freddy crouches down and starts his python routine again, trying to swallow Charlie. The pinball machine collapses, and she is up with a start and out the door. The whole place is swaying, and Charlie is incredibly disoriented. Heck, I'm disoriented at this point. She hears someone call her name, Charlie, but this voice is different. It wasn't like the voice of the ghost children. She went towards the voice and found a door, which when open blinded her with the amount of light it held beyond. "Charlie, are you okay?" the voice says, and it's John. As her eyes adjust and she can see more clearly, she also sees Jessica and Clay. Jessica is holding her own ears because of the awful sound. The children converge on them again and go after Jessica. She calls out that the sound is coming from the lights on the wall and says to break them. Clay shoots the lights with his gun, and they all watch as the children stopped in place. Clay went and shot out all the lights in all the rooms until the noise finally stopped. The children were no longer children, but they were just balloon boys looking exactly like the one I described earlier. Jessica says she feels as though she's been drugged and asked what's going on. "These things aren't real," Charlie steadied herself and slowly got to her feet. "I mean, they're real, but not how we're seeing them. This whole place is an illusion. It's twisted somehow. Those things," she gestured toward the wall where Clay had shot out the lights, "those things are like the disc we found. They emit some kind of a signal that distorts how we see." Charlie shook her head. "We have to get out of here," she said. "There's something worse here than these." John asks where the big ones are, referring to the kidnapping animatronics, and Charlie confesses she doesn't know where they are. All of the detailed lifelike creatures are now gone and replaced with crude versions with lumps for eyes and minimal details. Charlie asks how they found her and how they knew this place even existed. and they are hesitant to tell her what they followed. Just then, the stage door burst open and Twisted Freddy comes crashing through like the Kool-Aid Man. He looks a nightmare of misshapen features, and as he lurches forward, Jessica screams for Clay to shoot him. He shoots the heck out of him, adding one final bullet to the head that stops Freddy in his tracks. Freddy's appearance is quickly replaced with a lifeless, smooth plastic figure. Charlie leaned over to touch the plastic-looking material that was the creature's skin. It felt like something between plastic and human skin, a strange, malleable substance that was a little too soft, a little too slick. The feeling of it made her nauseous. The silence is broken by the clicking of claws on tile, as they turn around to see the wolf animatronic headed their way. As Clay is about to trip over Freddy's body, he notices an 8-foot-tall Bonnie behind Charlie and calls out to warn her. Either stupidly or bravely, Charlie walks towards them and asks why they've brought her here. "What is this place? What do you know about my brother?" she screamed. Clay drags her back from the animatrons and tells her that they need to go. Charlie asks the two again, "Why do you want me?" "They don't care about you. I'm the one that brought you here," a voice spoke from the same shadowed corner the wolf had emerged from. A figure limped forward from the darkness, and Jessica recognized his voice instantly. It is noted that they hear no breathing, but just the sounds of his shuffle. "You have something that belongs to me," said the voice. His face was dark, the color mottled, and it was swollen with fluid. Cheeks that had been hollow were now distended with the bloat of decay. His eyes were bloodshot, the burst capillaries threading through eyeballs that looked just a little too translucent. Something inside of them had gone bad, jelly-like. At the base of his neck, Charlie could see 2 pieces of metal gleaming. They extended from within his neck, rectangular lumps standing out from his mottled skin. He wore what had once been a mascot suit of yellow fur, though what remained was now green with mold. The group is kind of taken aback as they ask, "Dave?" He is not happy with being called Dave, though, and says he hasn't been Dave in a long time. "How about William Afton, then?" And he says, "Wrong again. I've accepted the new life that you gave me. You've made me one with my creation. My name is Springtrap." Springtrap talks about how he now controls all of the animatronics through a system that was designed for choreography during shows. He doesn't explain how he controls it, but just that he does. He also takes time to thank Charlie for releasing him from his tomb under the stage, that his animatronics would have eventually broken him free, but that she got it done ahead of schedule. It is made clear that he is not breathing when he comes close to Charlie's face, so whatever he is, it isn't human. He says he won't hurt her friends, but that he needs something from her. Clay reloads his gun with his last bullet and says, "You never know when a corpse may wander out of the shadows wearing a rabbit suit." As he shoots Springtrap, Clay tells the kids to run, and it's mentioned that Charlie actually has trouble breaking away from Dave as though under hypnosis, which is a little alarming, don't you think? She does, though, and they all run back the way they came, which is who knows what way. They're chased by the wolf as they can hear his claws scraping on the floor behind them. They get to the waterfall room, and Clay heads for the passage under the cliff where the water emerged. I guess this is the way they came in. I thought this was the same place Charlie went earlier, though, so it's confusing to me how she didn't find the way out, but oh well. They're on the other side of the room where the stream ran through it, when they see the animatronics hesitate at the water. They attempt to cross the waist-deep water, and while the wolf has some trouble keeping his footing, Bonnie makes it into the water no problem. They are all confused about how they can go through the water without ruining their circuitry, but Springtrap appears cackling behind them to say he designed his machines better than her father had. Charlie notices the gasoline cans she had passed earlier, and Clay asks if the animatronics are fireproof too. They toss the gasoline towards the water, and Clay lights a match to set it on fire. The creatures still crossing the water are stuck in the fire and get torched. They do make it to the side of the stream, but their illusions were already shut off, meaning their discs had likely been damaged. The plastic was all turning to liquid and falling from their bodies into pools. It sounds a lot like the description of those pictures we saw way back when, huh? With his minions taken care of, Springtrap turns tail and runs into the cave. Charlie runs after him, hungry for answers. She can feel that missing part of herself inside the cave, and she can't help but run towards it. The rest of the group are wary to pass the burning bodies of the wolf and Bonnie laying on the ground at the mouth of the cave, though. They try to find another way out since they can't get to Charlie. While heading towards the arcade, Freddy jumps out of the darkness at them, and to make matters worse, the still smoldering bodies of the 2 animatrons by the cave were now getting to their feet. Clay didn't have any bullets left, so they're feeling pretty screwed. Charlie finally finds Springtrap as he attempts to choke her out from behind. She fights him off and punches him in the chest, which leads to probably the worst line in the book, at least for me. "Things have changed since you died," Charlie said, surprised by the calm disdain in her voice. "For one thing, I've been doing sit-ups." Ugh, I mean, come on, you couldn't think of anything better for that? Damn. As if to make up for the worst possible dialogue ever, the coolest scene in the book happens next. So meanwhile, Clay, Jessica, and John are thinking this is the end for them, as they are surrounded by 3 animatronics. Just as the wolf is leaping at John, it falls to the ground as something knocks it out of the air. What was left that could attack the bad guys? The Mascots. Foxy tosses the wolf around like a rag doll, and then plunges his hook into the wolf. It's soon like Battle Royale up in here, with the good Mascots fighting Afton's creations. The screeches of metal ripping apart metal ground at their ears. Foxy continued to dig furiously, burrowing into the wolf as wires and parts fell from the sky. He snapped his jaws in the air, then tore at the wolf's stomach, wrenching out its insides and flinging them aside with brutal efficiency. The wolf was overpowered, its limbs flailing helplessly before falling heavily to the ground. Behind them came another inhuman screech. John whipped around in time to see the fire-ravaged Bonnie on its stomach being dragged steadily into the shadows. It screamed again as with a horrible grinding sound it was torn to pieces by whatever lurked in the shadows. Chica and Bonnie lurked in the shadows, and they ripped that twisted Bonnie apart. Foxy was done with the wolf and was now headed for the one remaining threat, the Twisted Freddy. While they fought, the Twisted Bonnie had crawled away from his attackers to grab John, but they were soon on him with fury again. Bonnie grabbed the gnarled rabbit's torso and threw it to Chica, who twisted its head off. Without so much as a peep upon finishing them off, they vanished into the dark. I loved this scene so much because it reminded me of something like Freddy vs. Jason, or even Hannibal Lecter. A bad guy who has redeeming qualities that make you kind of like them a bit. I mean, I was rooting for Freddy because he was funny as hell. I mean, do you guys remember that joke about the power glove? And Hannibal might have eaten people, but he also made one of his patients feed his own face to his dogs, and this guy was a rich, spoiled brat that tortured children and got away with it. So was Hannibal all that bad? I always find redeemable bad guys the most interesting in film, and this was no exception. In this specific case, though, it was also revenge. So back to the story. Charlie and Springtrap are still struggling with each other. She grabs a spike that had been used to keep a fake mushroom in place and stabs Springtrap in the chest with it. She demands he tell her why he took Sammy, as she starts yanking the spike back and forth while still in his chest. She yells at him to tell her why. "I didn't take him, I took you," Springtrap tells her. John and the gang catch up with them, and he says that they have to leave as all the fighting will likely bring the place down. Springtrap manages to roll away through some trapdoor that just magically happens to be there while 4 people are standing around that could have stopped him. The building is getting ready to collapse though, so they need to get going. They come to a heavy metal door that John and Clay work to pry open. They finally make it outside into the night. Well, kind of. Charlie realizes where they are, and it's the room under her house where she found the original animatronic. Charlie suddenly gets a sick feeling in her stomach and notices something weird about the walls. The next part is hard to describe, so I'll just quote the book, although it's a couple paragraphs worth of text. It was the walls. The whitewashed concrete was blinking in and out of existence, shivering like a dying bulb. It was the wall Charlie had been drawn to the first time they came to this place. Now she felt its pull as she had in the cave. It was stronger here than it had ever been, even in the dreams that left her drained and aching. "I'm here." She took a step toward the far wall and felt another pang in her stomach. Here. Yes, here. She went to the wall and put her hands on it as she'd done before, but this time the concrete was warm and somehow smooth despite the rough finish. "I have to get inside." For a moment she felt like she was in 2 places at once, here inside the little room and on the other side of the wall, desperate to get through. She drew back suddenly, taking her hands off the wall as if it burned. The illusion flickered, then died altogether. The concrete wall was made of metal, and at the center was a door. She acknowledges that this is the door that she had been drawing over and over with all those black rectangles. John and Jessica are screaming at her from outside that if she doesn't leave now, the house is going to collapse on her, but she can't hear them. She's too enthralled with this door. She put her hand on the door and felt a heartbeat. She hears pressure releasing and a clicking sound coming from the door and starts to almost pass out. John is at her side, telling her he loves her and that he is going to get her out of here. She finally relents and he leads her to the exit. As she's climbing the broken wall out of the basement-like area, she is torn back by something strong. It's the remains of the Twisted Freddy, completely implausible, but apparently it dragged itself through the rubble to grab Charlie. It pulls her into its chest without much trouble, and the others scramble to figure out how to get her out because she's going to die if the building collapses, and she's also going to die if the spring traps go off. All the while, Freddy is swinging his one remaining arm around trying to keep them away. Clay grabs a metal beam and starts bashing the Freddy in the head, screaming for it to let her go. It doesn't listen, and so even though it's got to be incredibly dangerous, he keeps on hitting it. During all of this, Charlie stays safe. They know this because her hand is sticking out the armhole, and she is still moving it. Some point after they knock the Freddy's head off, its arm stops swinging. While they are attempting to free Charlie through the chest, they hear a click. Suddenly, a single high-pitched click reverberated through the air. John and Clay froze, their hands still hovering over Freddy's chest. For a moment, the air stood still. Then the metal body convulsed violently. It launched itself off the ground, and a ghastly crunch of metal pierced the air. John reaches for Charlie's hand as if she's still alive, but with all of the blood flowing from the machine, it's likely not possible. Officers show up to the scene, and Clay orders them to get the kids out. John is ushered out, kicking and screaming, and as he looks back, he sees a dark-haired woman kneeling in the pool of blood, holding Charlie's hand. Before he can say anything, the house collapses. After it all, Jessica and John are joined by Artie the idiot at the diner to mourn Charlie's loss. John starts to think about Charlie's project with the strange faces and how they seemed a lot like Afton's creations, how they had blank faces with no eyes, and he wondered why she had made them. Marla shows up at the diner. She was from the first book, if you remember, and she asks what happened, and they tell her the house fell on her. I guess she's the Wicked Witch of the West, right? While Marla and Jessica talk, John recalls the woman who was kneeling near Charlie's body. He recalls that she had looked surprised to see him and that something was familiar about her. He finally remembers that the last day he saw Charlie when they were kids, that woman had come to pick her up from school. So now we know that Charlie's Aunt Jen was there, but how? Jessica suggests that maybe Clay called her. As everyone is trying to figure out how to cope with the fact that Charlie is dead, a car pulls up. As the woman exits the car and enters the diner, they are completely shocked to see that it's Charlie. Marla and Jessica run up to her as she walks in, but John stays in his seat. "That's not Charlie," he says. And that's the end of the book. Phew! So the reason this took me so long is because it's basically like doing a huge book report where you have to pick through an entire book and try to pick just the relevant parts that are necessary for a summary. If you can't imagine how long that sort of thing takes and the motivation required, well then I'll just tell you that it's a lot. 16 pages is how long this script is. So you can thank me later for actually managing to get this done in time for the next book. Now on to my favorite part, the discussion, or at least the part where I talk about all of the interesting tidbits that don't make sense and intrigue me. Tidbit number 1. How the heck was Aunt Jen at the collapsing house when she was? An even crazier theory is, what if Aunt Jen is actually Charlie or an older version of Charlie, and maybe she was behind the door? We heard what sounds like a pressure release door and some gears clicking when Charlie puts her hand on the door, so maybe after she walked away from it and went through her ordeal with the Freddy, the door fully opened and this Aunt Jen thing came out. Maybe Aunt Jen was another prototype created to take care of Charlie like a mother. And that leads to another question. What exactly are these people/robot things? We already know that Dave was in a Springtrap suit that went off based on his scars in the first book. And then we know that he got stuck in a Springtrap suit again, and that he bled all over the place, and was then stuffed into a tiny space for at least a year or so, and yet he came out alive, or kind of undead since he wasn't breathing. They also talk about how the blood on the ground was tested and wasn't actually blood, which lends towards it being some sort of synthetic blood that was likely used in these androids. So if Dave is one of these things, and now it's likely Charlie is too, and even Aunt Jen, then what are they and who made them? It's just really strange to me, because it doesn't seem like something Afton could come up with. He's too crazy, too crude, too maniacal to come up with something so advanced. But if Henry made them, it makes more plausible sense. If he made Charlie after his child was stolen and then made a caretaker to watch over her if anything were to happen to him. But what's the deal with Afton then? Is it possible that Afton was alive and then died and then a copy was created of him? Or was he always a robot? Why the heck would Henry create this guy, though? It makes no sense to me. Did someone else make him? Or is there some other unknown factor that could cue me in on the mystery here? Tidbit number 2. Closely related is the fact that we learned from Springtrap that Sammy wasn't taken and in actuality Charlie was. A lot of people suspected this may be the case, especially those with the Charlie as a robot theory. And it looks like they were spot on here. But I still have questions. What exactly did Charlie have that belonged to Dave/Afton/Springtrap that he wanted from her? He never says, and I can't think of much aside from the disc that she had taken, but that seems stupid. It's more likely that he means something to do with her specifically. Hell, maybe he even means her as in her, since his body is wrecked and he needs a new one. I mean, we don't know how this whole humanoid robot thing works. He might be able to transfer his consciousness too. But this all goes back to who the heck created Afton, and was he created before or after he took Charlie? Was Charlie always a robot? Or was she a child and then a robot? I mean, really, the same can be asked for Afton too. It's hard to know how all this works when everyone is a damn robot clone. Tidbit number 3. It's also incredibly interesting how many parallels there are in the book that exist in the game. I understand that the books are based on the game, but not supposed to be the same world as the game. I still always try to find the connections though, and it's incredibly interesting to me that Afton calls himself Springtrap, and Afton in the games is also Springtrap. So if this is true, I'm sure other connections can be found that are also true. Like the fact that the hall from Twisted Freddy's Pizza Place opens up into the room under Charlie's house reminds me a lot of FNAF 4, and how we later find the map and sister location of the same house from FNAF 4, as well as the surveillance cameras into the house, which leads you to think that the nightmare versions the child sees are real, and the whole thing is an experiment or torment, who knows which. It's almost like they're trying to tell us that this is how it could have happened, or maybe it's just like making a FNAF Frankenstein monster, it's hard to tell. Tidbit number 4. Lastly, it feels good to be right about the crude animatronic from the first book. For everyone that said Henry killed himself but completely ignored the crude design of the animatronic that killed him, I thought to myself, it must have been made by someone else, very likely William, and I was right. So finally we can put the whole Henry suicide theory to rest. He didn't kill himself, Afton killed him. If you want to make a compromise until we know differently from the third book, I'll say that it's possible that Henry found one of Afton's robots and tried to figure out what it was. We know he had the disc and he was trying to run diagnostics that Charlie later found, and maybe it came to life and killed him. Maybe this was an accident and maybe it was intended. There's no way to know for sure until it's clarified, but it's definitely not likely that he killed himself. Now all that's left is to find out what the deal is with the closets, which we'll find out shortly since the new book is coming out on the 26th, and it's called The Fourth Closet, so I'm sure it's got some answers. And I'm not making any promises about how long it's going to take me to get the summary together for the third book, because putting this together literally took my whole Sunday. It's like almost 11 at night right now, and my voice is killing me from recording all of this audio. I wouldn't be surprised if my voice completely changes from the beginning to the end. But anyway, I'll see you later. Hope you enjoyed it.